Shad.
Yeah.
Light them up.
Shad Robinson. Kind of similar path to most strength coaches. I exercise science, did a master's degree, GA in a weight room, college D1 weight room for a couple of years at ISU. Like Shelton, worked in the private sector for a total of, I don't know, probably close to 10 years now, combining it all together. So, and now my role here, coaching, helping do a lot of the programming and stuff like that. And then I also run the Human Performance Lab up at Idaho State University. So, and I'm faculty there in the Human Performance Department, focusing mostly on the exercise sciences and strength and conditioning, prepping kids to go be coaches too. So.
Yeah, so he's way smarter than us. So that's why we brought him around, right? So today we kind of brainstormed the topics. We're just going to let it go wherever it does, but talking about kind of effectiveness of training or how to get the most with the minimal work. So a lot of times what we see with our kids is we only get them for, an hour and a half, sometimes a little bit more, but hour and a half a week. So we have to really focus on what can we do in here or how can we do it and why are we doing it to make sure that we're getting the best results we can with our limited time. So that's kind of the topic we'll talk about today. So if you guys have any ideas to throw out there on the first part of it, in terms of a couple things we do in here to make sure we're maximizing our time.
Yeah, for us, we mostly work with youth athletes. So there's a lot of boxes to check. So we're trying to be pretty comprehensive as far as getting like a good dynamic warm up and getting like movement prep and getting kids moving through space. But then also we got to work on speed and the ability to jump and produce power. And then obviously the whole weight room side of it too. So I think just being very structured as far as how we're going to flow through that, and making sure we're staying on a schedule so we can kind of check all those boxes and give those kids everything they need in a 45-minute to an hour window.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot. And it is. Like if you were to look at our training 3 years ago, it was completely different. Like I think we were missing a lot of boxes. And then over time, we've kind of found a way that works the best for us to incorporate all those things. Because before we come from more of a traditional strength and conditioning background or strength side, I'd say. So we were focused a lot more on the lifting in the beginning and kind of were neglecting the running and really the plyometrics. At least we would do some box jumps and stuff like that, but we weren't getting like a lot of volume when it came to the smaller jumps and conditioning the lower leg and the foot. So I think that's a huge box that we were missing. And now it's like, how do you balance all that and put it all together? But I think we're doing a pretty good job with it on that. So let's talk a little bit too about, unless you have a point on that, like kind of what direction we go with kids that are potentially like in season versus out of season. Like what do we change when we go in season with kids? And maybe we can run into some of like misconceptions with training when it comes to like what the kids can do in season versus out. If you guys have any thoughts on that. My first one is like, I think sometimes people shy away from intensity when really you can keep that intensity. I think the volume is going to be more of where cutting that back is going to allow the athletes to not get as sore. Like if they come in and did, 3 or 4 reps of a heavy front squat, that's probably not going to leave them blasted. But if they came in and did like 3 by 10 or something like that during the season, that's going to leave them a lot sore, even if it's at a lighter weight.
Well, research shows that too, that if you can keep the intensity high, you can massively reduce volume, both intra-session and intra-week. So if you're saying that, your session is either shorter or you're doing fewer sessions per week, as long as you maintain that high intensity, you reduce detraining over time. So that's basically the strategy that we're employing there, is just trying to minimize the effects of detraining. And the most important, parameter that you look at there is just maintaining a high level of intensity. But, obviously that can't be on game days, and obviously that's can't interfere with their practice schedules and everything else to as much of a degree as possible. But.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's something that maybe other coaches, like people shy away from, is like heavy load, but when really load probably, when used correctly, isn't really the issue. It's more volume, right?
Yeah, for sure. And then same thing on the sprint side too. So Like when you're like the sprinting and the power side of it, those gains, I guess you could say, go away a lot quicker than the strength side. So even in season, we do still want to sprint and get our kids moving fast. But the difference is we've got to kind of understand what they're doing in their sport. And then we're going to lower our volume in here. So they might only get, like when they come in a week, they might only get 3 or 4 full speed sprints, but we still have to be hitting that stimulus because we want them to be peaked and ready to go by the end of the season. So we still want them running as fast as they can and improving those metrics if they can throughout the season.
Yeah.
And especially with our world is a little bit different where we don't really have the luxury of like a true off season with most of our kids. So like right now, for example, fall sports in Idaho just ended. And so we have a ton of volleyball and soccer kids, and the state tournament for volleyball was Friday, Saturday, and basketball tryouts were on Monday. I kind of feel like we're almost always in season a little bit. And so finding ways to still drive adaptations, keeping the intensity high, but the volume down, like you two have already talked about, is huge for keeping the improvements, but then not making them feel like they're beat up all the time.
And then one thing to add on that is with the intensity, that's with focus, which is kind of the purpose of this podcast. So the intensity is focused on the actual metric that we're trying to improve. So what we're talking about right now is increasing speed. So that's not conditioning. So we're not doing any conditioning with our kids. We figure that's probably something that's happening in their sport in general, but we make sure in general that our drills very rarely turn into conditioning. If we're working speed, they're getting plenty of rest. So the rep itself is very intense, but it's that same level of intensity every single time. It's not something where they're, running hard and then they're getting right back in line and doing it again and again and again, right? So we keep the intensity high within a rep, but they get plenty of rest so that they can maintain that throughout the whole session.
Yeah, I think that was a great point to catch, just in case somebody's listening to this and didn't understand that, because a lot of times I think with the exercise being somewhat of a sport now, right? Like if somebody hears intensity, they might think, oh, like the session was intense in terms of like how fast we were moving, the load, what it took out of the athlete. But what we're referring to, like Shad said, is the intensity within the reps. So it's not, they should get a massive rest if you're working to develop speed. The athlete needs to be able to run, over at least 95% of their best to actually be working on speed. So that brings up a good point I just wrote down. Maybe we can give a little bit of insight. So Shelt mentioned, conditioning in a way that's going to peak an athlete towards the end of the season versus potentially coming into the season overtrained and maybe running into injuries halfway through the season. So what advice do we have for, a sport coach listening to this that, is a little uncomfortable with their athletes being out of shape in the beginning of the season, or feel like they need to run them a bunch at the beginning because that's what they did back when they played? Any thoughts on that?
I think a lot of times we see a very small subset of the people. And so I do still think there are probably a lot of those kids that are coming in unprepared. And there is going to be a time period at the beginning of the season where it's just going to be a bit of a grind for them if they haven't been doing anything else. Like we'd luck out and have, I would say, an elite sample of people who are willing to come in and put in extra work and pay to put in extra work year round. Yeah. But I would say that for most coaches, especially at like the adolescent level, that's not the reality for most of the kids. They probably have half the team that's been, sitting around playing Fortnite all summer, and now they're having to get them ready for a season.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. I think it's kind of different worlds in terms of that. I do know that you should peak at the end of the season. Yeah. So if you're grinding guys into pace at the beginning and then they're just limping into the end of the season, you're not going to have a good playoff run if you even get there. So that would be my thing on that, is just to, make sure that there's some sort of periodization plan throughout the season where we're looking at peaking more towards the middle or the end rather than just, grinding them into dust at the beginning and having freak shows in the first 2 weeks and then everybody's hurt and tired at the end. But
yeah. And I think, remembering from when I played sports, I feel like even if I was going to let's say for football, I went to all the summer stuff, right? You stayed training all year long. There is an element of like at the beginning of the season, like it's really hard to exactly mimic the demands of a sport, the adrenaline, like how athletes are going to react. Like I feel like the first couple of games I always kind of felt out of shape, even if I was in shape. You know what I'm saying? So that might not be something that, like, if your basketball kids play their first game as a team at the high school level and they're like, look a little winded, like that might just be something that you don't need to really freak out about.
Yeah.
Like that's going to clean itself up as you go.
Yeah, I don't even. I wouldn't say that's even a problem.
Yeah.
You know, for nobody's looking good the first couple of games.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think a way around that, I mean, obviously as a sport coach, maybe some of like the traditional conditioning methods of gassers and things like that after practice can be effective at a small dose. But really the way to get kids prepared to play a game and get in shape for a game is like competitive game-like situations in practice. And so rather than just getting all your conditioning with sprints after, looking at what drills you're doing, how are you making the kids compete throughout practice, could potentially help with that as well. And I think the biggest thing is, and something that we do a really good job with is getting to know your kids. So every kid's going to be able to handle a little bit different volume, and if you can get to know the kids, and if do you have a good group of kids that are going to go to bed on time? Are they eating? What are they doing outside of practice? Are they super focused and engaged? They might be able to handle a little bit more early on than if you got kids that come in a little more detrained. They're not going to bed on time. They're not eating well. So kind of like asking those questions, and as a coach, getting to know the kids can kind of help them structure that and understand how much their kids are going to be able to handle.
Yeah. And I think that rolling from that too is, I think sometimes coaches, like, let's say you had a group of kids you were doing a drill with, and you can see like some kids, they didn't train during the summer or they didn't train and they're totally gassed. But you've got maybe some people that worked harder and they're still getting good reps and working. Like, I think at the high school level, it would be tough for some coaches to potentially stop the people that look like they're just like spent and say, okay, you guys have done enough today. You know, you can like kind of just stand on the side and watch or whatever, and let the people that have worked, that are continuing to get good reps, continue to get some work in. Like, I think that would be a tough thing to do, but I think that could be beneficial. Like, especially like Shelt said, you know, your athletes, you know, who's prepared to a higher degree or not, and you know, kind of how they respond to stuff. So you could potentially like individualize a little bit more at your practices if you were comfortable, you know, letting athletes know, hey, you've done enough today. Let's rest on that. Let's put in somebody that's fresh, you know? So that's maybe something to think about when you're doing those drills and looking at, you know, that high intensity game-like situation. I think Shelt's right on point there. Like when we play games in here, they run way harder than we're just doing normal sprint drills. So if you can make anything, gamify it, make them play against each other, put it into settings that are, you know, focusing on the specific thing that you want to work on, I think that's probably the best way to really get conditioning in a sport.
Yeah, for sure.
Since we're talking about conditioning, I think it's worth saying that like how you set that up matters too.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times we think about conditioning as, I didn't know we were going to get into this topic, but one thing that I use a lot with the conditioning is rather than just like have people run like the traditional methods. I mean, people within our industry know that interval training is by far the best way to increase like those physiological metrics fast, right? Like like lung capacity, ability to clear lactate. All of those things are way better dealt with interval training than with other like long distance running or something like that, which is what a lot of people default to. Even still, with some of my young kids will come in and say, "Oh yeah, we start practice the half-mile run or whatever." So when we're talking about the conditioning, one of the better things that we can do is mimic gameplay as much as possible. But that doesn't always have to be playing the game. That doesn't mean we have to scrimmage all the time for conditioning. That can look like you set up intervals based on positions and make it very specific. Like for it, let's talk about soccer. Like you've got backfielders, goalies, whatever. You've got a bunch of different positions within soccer. What do they do throughout the game? How much are they walking? How much are they running? How much are they sprinting? And then you break that down into the interval set. So maybe they spend a third of the game standing around, a third of the game running, a third of the game jogging or whatever, right? Just to make it easy. That's what your intervals look like in practice.
Yeah.
And then you set that up by position. And so you've got your position groups, and then you individualize it based on the position groups and what they actually need to be within there. So that's sports specificity, right? Not just throwing a soccer ball at them while they're doing the traditional gassers that every single athlete's done since the 50s, right? So you can kind of dial that in a little bit for your group and even positionally, or even by person, like what Sheldon was talking about. If you have the ability to do that, and not every high school coach is going to be able to do that when you've got 40 kids on your team, but if you can, then you can even individualize that to the person too. But that's probably your best conditioning strategy outside of just a game, is you got to interval it and gamify it if at all possible. But just make sure that it's relevant to what they're actually doing in game settings, which might be like a boring job. Like what I did as a GA is sit there with a stopwatch and game film and figure out when they're doing what. And then we turn that into our conditioning intervals. So
yeah. It's like basically what we do with our training, like the idea of just reverse engineering, what are the demands and then how do we train for them versus like, let's just run a 2-mile conditioning test at the beginning of at the season. And it's like, that doesn't make any sense really. So Chad said it, you heard it. We have GPS units too. So if you're in Pocatello and you want us to come strap a GPS unit on one of your players, it has to be outside. So basketball is probably not going to work, but soccer teams or clubs or whatever, we'd be happy to do that and give you a little bit of data on, what's going on with your athletes and maybe how you can make that conditioning more relevant to what they're doing. So those are all good topics. I thought about that today. So I kind of wanted to swing into some topics I've seen on Twitter and stuff lately. And that's going to be, our opinions on like, and I think I already know them, but the way that would we rather have an athlete come in more just in the off season, stop in season, or would we rather have somebody come like 2 times a week instead of 3, but come throughout the entire year? So maybe we can hit on like the importance of in-season training, how that's going to help athletes be better towards the end of the season. And it's interesting. Not all our kids stayed super consistent all the way through volleyball season, but we actually had an odd thing where 2 of our teams weren't like the best in the beginning of the season, but then overperformed at the end of the season. And I wonder if it comes down to like other kids were getting a little beat up, a little tired. The kids they trained pretty hard all year round and did pretty good at the beginning of the season coming in. So I thought that was interesting that we had 2 teams that lost a lot to the same teams in the beginning of the year, and then were able to win and go to state at the end of the year. So let's just take that all the way back to, what's the importance of training in season versus just doing off season and taking the in-season time off. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Yeah, initial thoughts is I think if you just break it down and say somebody's going to come in 3 or 4 times a week for their off season only. So say that's a 4 or 5 month period. And then they'll come in 2 times a week all year round. If you break that down, I've done this before. They end up getting like 30 or 40 more sessions throughout the year if they come year round just twice a week, rather than if they come 3 or 4 times a week just in their off season. So with kids, I mean, the biggest thing, in my opinion, is consistent quality reps. So all of this is super new to them.
I like that.
And they're trying to figure out their bodies and they're growing. I mean, I had a kid that came here for soccer training in the summer, took the fall season off because he was in soccer, popped back in yesterday. He grew like 4 inches in 3 months.
Wow.
So like kids are growing, they're trying to figure their bodies out. So if they can stay in here and get consistent quality reps, that's going to help them continue to improve. So I think that's the biggest thing with, as far as that age group of just keeping a consistent routine to continue to drive adaptation.
Yeah. Anything to add to that?
I think that pretty much nails it. I mean, the year round is obviously superior. And then we even get the opportunity, taking it to like, and we're not rehab specialists by any means, but kids do get beat up.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can see them consistently through the season, we can help with that. A lot of times, like I've got a group of baseball guys right now. They're, overuse injuries of the elbow and shoulder are super common, especially in baseball. Most of our athletes have very specific movement patterns, but like sports like baseball, overhead sports, volleyball are even more so. And so we can really do a lot to negate or mitigate the effects of those overuse movement patterns that they're in all season long. And if we lose that all season, they're really probably not necessarily going to decrease in their performance of their sport a lot. right? If you're a volleyball player, you're still hitting the ball. Or if you're a baseball player, you're still throwing a ball a million times a week, right? So you're probably not going to see massive performance decreases in that regard. But a lot of the work that we do with those types of athletes is the antagonist muscles, right? Is like the back. We really try to do a lot of back training, especially with the baseball guys. I've got a whole shoulder rehab routine that they're going through before every session. And so if we can stay consistent on those, especially within the season, not saying we're going to be able to prevent all injuries, but if we can at least reduce or mitigate, or if they get beat up, right? I've got even just Little League footballers right now that I'm working with that are just getting to the end of their season, and they consistently would come in with, some little problems like, I tweaked my hamstring a little bit in practice last week. What can we do? And we can help them through those things a little bit better than just setting them loose and they only play their sport. And now we've got all these things that we got to fix at the end of the season before we can even get back into our training. So I kind of look at it as like a prehab or a continual rehab as well for just making sure that we try to mitigate injury. I mean, injury at the end of the day is going to end far more careers than lack of skill will, right?
Yeah.
Especially once you start getting into the higher levels. So if we can teach people strategies to get through that and help them get through that in the season, we're way better off consistently. So
yeah, that was awesome. And I think it's a slippery slope too, where in today's sport culture, like as we work with high school kids and middle school kids, so it's not like a college necessarily where they've kind of narrowed it down in most cases to one sport. If you decide to take like an in-season, let's say you like are going into a sport and you decide to take that time off, that could be kind of a slippery slope because you might get used to that and then get comfortable with that. And then you realize that you have sport all year round. Like you have a club and then you got a team and you got another club, or there's always something going on. So I think if you just decide like, I'm not going to train in season, you're going to have that same excuse after that season's over because there's another season and another season. So the kids that make the most progress in here, you definitely see making the results, are the ones that just find a way to make it work. Like they prioritize it, either come in the morning or we open up later evening sessions for them and they keep making it in, and then they don't kind of fall into that trap of, dropping out of it for 4 or 5 months until they finally get the motivation to come back in again. So I know we're all familiar with that, but I think sometimes parents don't realize like their kids have a lot of sport going on, a lot of practice going on. So there's always going to be kind of a in-season excuse per se, right? So if you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, kids are busier than they've ever been. I always tell parents too that even if you're like in the heart of your season, you're super busy and you're playing a couple games a week, and even if they can make it in one time, I think that's huge. Again, just to continue to practice getting reps and get some of the adaptations. Obviously 2 or 3 is ideal, but even if you can only get in one time. But I totally agree. I think with most of our kids, if you decide you don't want to come in season, you're probably only going to be training in the summer. Which is just not enough. You're just not going to accumulate enough time to really make steady improvements. Every time you come back in, you're going to, like Shad already kind of mentioned, you're going to kind of have to reset rather than building upon a foundation that we already have developed.
Yeah. It'd be like if you said, I'm only going to shoot a basketball 3 months of the year, but I'm a basketball player, so yeah, that is tough. And I think another aspect that just popped in my head while we were talking about this is like, let's just talk about the mental side of it in terms of, sport can beat you down. Usually coaching can be, it's a sport. So there's people that play, there's people that don't play. There's losses every day in a game. Like you feel like you failed. I think one thing that's really awesome about what we do here is pretty much, I think every kid walks out of here feeling like it's a win, right? Every day. I can't think in my head the last time I had a kid walk out of here and be like upset about what happened while they were in here. So if anything, that gives your athlete, like, let's say they aren't playing as much as they want, or they don't feel like they're as good as they want to be, at least they're once or twice a week, they're getting in somewhere that's positive and they're winning every time. So that's going to help your athlete be a little bit more resilient throughout the season rather than spending 4 months feeling like they're failing and not really getting a lot of wins. And so I think that can be a huge benefit just on that side of it, of keeping the confidence levels up of your youth athlete.
That's one thing that I try to do as a coach. And one reason I really like working with these two is because they do a great job at this too, is in my other line of work, I talk a lot about coping skills in terms of research and how do we cope with adverse situations. And I've always thought, and I don't necessarily have a lot of proof for this, but working out and training and weight training and any kind of physical activity, you're kind of microdosing trauma to some degree, right? And every time you do something in here that's hard, we have people all the time come in, they have to do something hard. And maybe at first they're a little unconfident. Maybe they don't want to do it. Maybe it's a little shaky. And they do it and they get a little bit of a confidence boost every single time that happens. But we're teaching them like positive ways that they deal with the hard things that happen. And that's going to be life's hard sometimes. Sports hard sometimes. Sports just an analog of life, just kind of condensed down into an hour-long game. But there's a lot of adversity that comes up across life. And I really feel like weight training and the kind of training that sport does is it really gives kids positive coping strategies for dealing with those kinds of things. And especially if we on the coaching end can keep it very positive. I could scream at kids when they fail on a rep, and I could probably get good results out of them by doing that, right? A lot of coaches have employed that strategy over a long time. You just get real loud and everybody just falls in line. We got loud, deep voices and we can make that happen. But if you can be positive about it and put a positive spin on this all the time, you really teach that effort is what matters. And over the course of their lives, if they're more focused on the task and doing well at the task rather than just only the outcome, like, oh, I hit this lift or I hit this specific speed, I'm not necessarily worried about that all the time. I'm worried about how much effort did you put in and how hard did you try? And your hamstring hurts and you're tired because you stayed up too late on TikTok last night or whatever, but did you get through it? And how positive did you feel after that, right? And maybe you didn't get your number, but they're more likely to next time because they loved how they felt after that, right? So it just kind of goes with what you guys are saying. But that's I think the biggest thing is just staying positive and teaching them that there are a lot of ways to overcome adverse situations. And one of them is by, just being positive. Just keep showing up and keep grinding away at the task. And don't worry so much about the outcome. If you take care of your business every day, eventually the outcome's going to take care of itself. So
yeah, I love that. That was great. Yeah, I hope that gives some insight, because we have a lot of parents of kids that come in the gym that listen to this, coaches, just kind of give you an insight of like maybe another way to see what's going. Like that's why in season's important too. Is it's the work we're doing in here. I can't speak for every gym, but there's a lot of places doing the same type of thing where, we're leading through that positive type of influence. And we control this micro setting so well, like we're able to with the way we've built the gym, that it can be that every day. It can be a win every day. And it can be something where, like Shad hit on, like they're coming in, they're learning how to they're doing things that are hard to them or scary to them, but we have our finger on it enough that we know it's going to be a win. Like they're never going to walk out of here and not feel like they accomplished it or at least made progress on it. And then that just sets them up to start to think that way themselves. And then when we care about the kids, whatever, college sports, cool. We love it. But really it's like, how do we set these kids up to be successful in life? Like that's more important to me than going and playing at the next level. Yeah, it's not even close. So I think we do a good job of that. But well, cool. Well, we'll wrap it up because this recording only has 30 more seconds on the web browser. We maximized our time. Hopefully that was insightful to you guys. If you have any questions on what we talked about today, feel free to send them over on any of our social media channels. They're all linked up in the bio. And this was great. Get you guys on here. So now I think we're going to commit to this once a month. I haven't asked them yet, but I'm just throwing that out there, putting it on the airwaves. So keep an eye out. We'll just call them the Crew Podcast, and then I'll put in the notes kind of a summary of what we talked about. And appreciate you guys. Leave us a review and have a great day.